Configure these, the file system connector and the SharePoint connector. So if you look at it from a diagram perspective, it looks like I got some of my, some of this didn't tab over very well, but it's folder, file, 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 folder, file, file, file. And you've got multiple servers back here. This is a very common scenario. You got more than one server. You can set up the connector either on board or off board. If you set it up off board, you just have to get another resource to help you. You'll have to get another server and then download and install the software. Here you just have to configure it on the GSA. The configuration for both of these is the same though. That's nice. It's just the question is whether you're going to install that software off the box or not. It'll alphabetically scan Microsoft Windows file shares or other SMB enabled servers. So if you have Unix, you need to enable it with a Samba server. It will give each document and its ACL updates. So as documents change on the backend content servers, the connector is smart enough to detect those changes and push them into the GSA. It's using a feed, and it's going to, in the case of the file system connector, it's going to use a content feed. Content feed pushes the URL along with the metadata and the content. So there's no crawling going on here in this case. It'll also inject the ACLs, the access control lists, so that each user and group that has permission to the documents can be included in the search appliance, and there's no back-end head requests coming back here. So that's really good. You're not going to see a drop in performance. You won't see search results dropped. It handles head requests if ACLs are not given. Now, the one thing about the ACLs right now that's a little bit of a limitation is they don't support the deny ACL. So if there's a deny, if you have an ACL back here that says user 1 or user 5 will not have access to the document, then that ACL doesn't get put into the search appliance for that URL. And so at search time, the GSA will see no ACL and it'll send out a head request. So you might see some head request traffic going back and forth if you have deny ACL. Let's see, the options for the onboard crawler, it's faster in terms of, this is the onboard crawler. It's not the onboard connector, it's this SMB crawler. And it'll crawl file systems faster. So if crawling, if you got millions of documents in your file server and crawl is slow, then you can set up the SMB crawler. And all you have to do there, you don't even have to set up this connector. You just use SMB crawl patterns and SMB URLs for your crawler access. What that looks like is under here, under crawl and index, instead of entering in HTTP, you just enter in SMB and then the name of the host and the name of the path, right? Do the same thing for your follow and crawl, and then when you go to crawler access, do the same here. You'll just set up your SMB pattern, user ID, and password to crawl the content. Now, the drawbacks to this onboard crawl, the advantage here is it's really quick for configuration, and the crawler is much faster than the connector. The drawback is that you might start to see the timeouts in the serve at serve time, so not all the search results will be included. And you don't have the onboard ACLs. So you may start to see performance hit just in general at search time for serving those results. We're going to look at the connector as the focus point. That's where our future development is going to be made. If you have more than 300,000 documents, you'll have to use the off-board connector. What happens is this is a Tomcat application, and the Apache web server can have the amount of RAM that's dedicated to it configurable if it's an off-board connector. If it's an on-board connector, we cannot configure that because there's other resources competing for RAM. So greater than 300,000 documents, use the off-board connector. No, they don't have to match anyway to the GSA. So it's just it's a Tomcat application. It can be a Windows server or it can be a Linux server. It's got a MSI or it's got either an MSI installer if it's Windows, or it's I don't know what it is if it's Linux, but it's just a Java application, and so it just the installer runs on there. We've got some suggestions in terms of how much RAM to configure for it in the connector. So it depends on how many documents you have, and you can just up the RAM to like 3 gigabytes. That would be good. Here's what the connector handles and what it doesn't handle. So files and folders, it will find all the folder. You just give it the root path, and it'll find all the subfolders and all the documents, and you can include patterns and you can exclude patterns just like you do with the crawl and index settings. It'll include the general properties of files. Here we go. Here's general properties on a file, right? These will be added as metadata automatically for you. It supplies document level allow ACLs, but we don't currently handle directory ACLs. So if you set up access control lists at the directory level, those will not be injected into the GSA. And you could use the policy. It's called a policy ACL at that point because it's going to apply to a general URL pattern and not just individual URLs. If you do need to have directory level ACLs, though, there is an option. You can write you can use the policy ACL API and write a script that will inject those into the GSA. If there's only a few of them, then you can even do it using the admin console, which I showed you just a few minutes ago when I set up a policy ACL. Username and password credentials will be handled. The connector uses NTLM for crawling, so your file system has to be NTLM enabled. And it can use Kerberos or LDAP for serving. Kerberos would be silent, LDAP would be with a prompt. The connector handles Samba file servers, CIF file servers, and DFS. It's a CIFS-based. It's using a CIFS-based library in Java. The NFS is also supported with a little bit of work, and there's a couple of details there. It'll crawl. It says 1.2 million docs per day, but that's optimal. That's a very optimistic number. Now, the 1.2 million docs per day was an optimal test. What we did was we put a file server, we put a GSA, we connected them in the network, and said, all right, now load those files. All right, so there's no other network traffic slowing us down. It's not got many there's no firewall hops or anything like that. So you'll want the news is that you want to test the crawl rate and see if that's satisfactory. So put it in a little test first, see if it's working. Now, PowerPoints tend to run slower. It's just the conversion utility that runs. PowerPoints they're not text-based like you think they are. They're actually hierarchical objects within objects within objects. You know, a slide, a bullet, a tab, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it takes a while to crawl those, and the rate's about 50,000 per day. You can have start patterns up to 24 maximum per connector. So that means that literally you could connect up to 24 different file system servers to one connector. Okay? But if you have more than 24 start patterns, then you'll have to use a second connector. That's all. What does it not handle? Folder hierarchy. So it'll insert the files in a flat list. Okay? You'll still see the full URL to the document inside of that URL, but it's just a flat list. We mentioned that we don't handle deny or directory ACLs. We do not handle, it does handle SMB 2.0. That needs to be updated. So how do we set it up? Well, you configure your follow and crawl pattern. Because we're using a content feed, we don't issue a start pattern on the GSA, but we will when we configure the connector. We'll tell the connector where to start. Configure LDAP for groups and run a test user to make sure the groups you expect are coming back. Then configure the connector, which is just entering in a couple of patterns and a crawl credentials, and review your feeds and crawl diagnostics and policy ACLs. Since we're using a content feed, and it's a connector, we use something slightly different because the connector is going to be doing the authentication on the users. So we use this special pattern called Google connector colon. And after this, in the pattern, when the patterns or the URLs are added to the crawl diagnostics, you'll see slash and then the localhost dot and the name of your connector slash, and then you'll see the full SMB path to it. A little bit of funky naming, but what this is telling the GSA is during authorization, do the checks with the connector. Don't use the LDAP connector don't use LDAP or the other sample URL to check for it. Check these boxes for user authentication and group lookups. You can use LDAP for your authentication, but this pattern still applies. So you have an option. You can use the connector for authentication or you can use LDAP. Here's how the connector gets configured. So you'll go to connector administration. If you're going to use the onboard connector, there's a connector manager called Connector Manager 0, which is used for the onboard connectors. So just select that from the drop-down if you have more than one connector manager set up. Click Add New Connector, give it a name, select File Connector Type, and get Configuration Form. On the configuration form, you specify the start paths, and they're SMB, and here's the file server, and there's the shared folder path. You cannot just point them to a host, okay? So you have to, if you're using Windows file shares, you have to give a host and a path. And then these are equivalent to your include patterns on the follow and crawl under crawler index. So here's your start pattern, here's your follow and crawl pattern. Under the configuration, you'll also give a username, password, and if it's on a Windows share, you have to give the Windows domain name. Here's some throttling that can be set, mislabeled. It's the amount of time that they wait after a complete crawl before they start another crawl to check for updates. You can disable traversal if you're in the process of upgrading your software on the GSA. And you can set a connector schedule as to when the connector will contact the content server, ask for content, and bring that into the GSA. You can set up, certain hours, like in the evening, or exclude hours. Just like with a feed, as we saw before, under the feeds page, now you'll see incremental as the type. That's a content feed. You'll see whether you failed an error and how many URLs you got. Under the crawl diagnostics, here's what the URLs are going to look like. There's going to be there's going to be a doc ID here, and the SMB path to the individual documents. It's going to be a list of it's going to flat file list. You'll also see under each individual document the list of users and a list of groups that have permission to the document. That's the ACL that's getting injected. You won't see the ACLs show up in the policy ACLs. Policy ACLs apply to an entire directory of files. Remember, the connector doesn't support that. It'll help to turn off any other security that you have set up. Okay? Because what happens is you might have multiple protocols set up here, and you start to get a little confused as to who you're actually logging in as. So I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to add a follow and crawl pattern here. This is the Google connector. Pattern. So when the connector gets configured, it's going to start pushing content, and the GSA is configured to accept those URLs. Go to Connector Administration. I can either click on the connector or go directly down to Connectors. I'm just going to go to Connectors. It's a little less confusing sometimes. Here's the drop-down. Since I only have one connector manager, 0, that's fine. Click Add New, give it a name, like My Files. And the connector type is going to be File. We also have an onboard SharePoint and onboard LDAP connector. Here's the configuration page, SMB, and waterloo.learngsa.com/shared files. Let's go take a quick look at the Waterloo server so we know what we're getting into here. My computer, here we go. Under C drive, shared files, and I have sharing turned on for this folder. This is a Windows file share. So student has access, SharePoint admin has access, and the administrator has access. Now let's look at give AD as the domain, student as the username, and password 1. Just have to make sure that there is a user that has read permission on all the content for setting up crawling. Click Save, and The connector shows green light status. That means it was able to establish a connection to the server. If I go to the feeds page, I should see my feed, which is pushing in the content. Here's my files. It's an incremental. It's in progress. Found 4 URLs, no errors. Go to status and reports to check the crawl diagnostics. And here's where we'll notice the name of the connector. So here's its full pattern, Google connector ://myfiles.localhost. When I drill down, here's the flat list of files, and here's the path. Now, one thing to notice is this is the URL that you're going to see when the user clicks on a file. If you want to rewrite these URLs in the XSLT style sheet to be UNC enabled, then the user could click on the search result and be prompted with a Windows dialog if they're on a Windows machine, says, do you want to download or view this in Word? Let's click on click on one of these documents. We'll find the per URL ACLs. Now, I don't see the per URL ACLs here right now. That indicates to me it's not fully or completely indexed yet. I should see the list of users and groups that have access to it. If I go to the cache version, it's going to ask me for a user ID and password. Since the ACLs aren't fully updated, it might not work yet. Let's see. Password. Still in the indexing process. All right. Now for the authentication phase, I'll go to Administration, set up my LDAP. This is important because I need to get my users in groups, and I need to also authenticate my users. So I've set one up, it looks like already. That's good. I just need to go to the serving mechanisms and make sure that LDAP is selected and nothing else. Okay, cool. LDAP is selected for both users and both group lookup and user authentication. So I think I'm ready to go. Let's go to Firefox, open up a session. This time look for NTLM. Get prompted. I'll have to enter in student, password 1. I was authenticated because I didn't get reprompted, but I just didn't see any results yet because they're not in the index. Go back to the index and check on the status. I still don't see the list of users and groups in there. That'll be the last thing that shows up. System. So let's take a look. Let's go back and see what our status is on our file system connector. And let's update this page. There's my ACLs. Okay. Administrator, SharePoint administrator, and student have access. Here's the groups. One of those URLs includes, let's look at the cached version. Oh, not NTLM, looks like HTTP is in there. So let's do a search for HTTP. This is actually just, it looks like a HTTP header. It's just a text document with an HTTP header in it. Let's do this. Let's clear the session cookie, close down Firefox, and reopen it. And try running it again. I'm going to put in AD/student because that's part of the that's the domain I'm part of. Make sure I get the proper authentication. Let's run HTTP. Here we go. Woo! Okay, let's just double check and make sure it's from that. Yep, it's from Waterloo. Now, this is an interesting caveat. What's going to happen when the user clicks on a search result link to an SMB file? Yeah, you will want to tend to launch it locally. But I'm on a Firefox browser in, or sorry, is it Chrome? Chrome browser in Mac. And that SMB URL, let's see what it just did. Did it download it? Yep. It downloaded it. Very cool, based on its file name. Now, it depends on what that extension is going to be as to what's going to do. Let's go and see. What's this one do here? This one might be a little bit funky here. So part of my title of my document is an actual HTTP header. And so it's actually saying it's trying to do an HTTP GET request. The URL got a little bit, when the GSA created the URL, it created an HTTP link to this Washington server. That's something I have to fix as a demo. It's just not good. All right. The point being there that you may have to do some URL mapping between the SMB file name and the link behind it. And that's just an XSLT style sheet change that you can make that performs that mapping.